Aliens haven't proven to be either false or true, but these UFO incidents are pretty convincing. Join us as we have a look at 10 of the most mind-blowing alien sightings ever. The Roswell Incident. The Roswell Incident of 1947 is perhaps one of the most famous alien encounters ever reported, with it also being one of the most controversial events to happen that year. It would be in the middle of 1947 when a United States Army weather balloon would crash onto a ranch in Roswell, New Mexico, an event that would prompt much suspicion from surrounding citizens. An official report stated that the balloon must have been around 12 feet long. However, amongst all of the wreckage, there was no sign of any kind of metal in the area, which might have been used for an engine, and there were no propellers of any kind. There were also no words found anywhere on any of the instruments or pieces that were recovered. After the incident, rumors of flying saucers in the area began to circulate, and the government stepped in to cover it all up, never giving an official explanation, which of course set off conspiracy theorists and launched a never-ending campaign for those who want to believe. The Kenneth Arnold Case. On June of 1947, a pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold would report having seen 9 objects that glowed bright blue flying in a V formation. In fact, he compared them to saucers that you would skip across the water. That may seem like the stereotypical alien or extraterrestrial sighting, but he also had a very descriptive and in-depth synopsis of what he saw. Of the many interesting things that he had to say about the supposed UFO, he said in an interview that it was while he was searching for the crash that he noticed a terrific blue flash that passed by the nose of his airplane. It was followed by a train of very peculiar-looking objects that were rapidly approaching a mountain at about 107 degrees from his location. He assumed at the time that the new formation or new type of jet may be in the area, though he was baffled by the fact that they didn't have any tails. He also judged from the wingspan of the objects that they were at least 100 feet in width. These may have been UFOs, but then again, it could have just been hallucinations or birds. The Rendlesham Forest Incident. The Rendlesham Forest Lights were a series of sightings that took place in Rendlesham Forest, England, and are believed to be UFO sightings. It would be in the late 1980s that several military officials and civilians would begin to report seeing strange lights, and that would be followed up with depressions in the ground on the next day. The official military reports would state that at the time, animals on a nearby farm had gone into a frenzy, and that the object was briefly sighted approximately an hour later near the back gate. After this incident, 3 depressions of 1.5 inches deep and 7 inches in diameter would be found where the object had been sighted on the ground. Then, the next evening, the area would be checked for radiation. Later on that night, a red sun-like light had been seen through the trees in the forest, moving about and pulsing. At one point, it appeared to throw off glowing particles, and then broke into 5 separate other objects, just before disappearing. Immediately after the disappearance, 3 star-like objects would be noticed in the sky, 2 to the north and 1 to the south. Nobody knows for sure if these objects were actually UFOs, or just new military technology being tested. The Levelland UFO Case. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik 2 into orbit, and within hours, multiple UFO sightings began to appear in the small town of Levelland. Now granted, this is a small, quiet Texas town, where at the time in 1957, nobody would have known about Sputnik 2. But nonetheless, sightings were reported. A key article about the case stated that the sheriff's office scoffed that evening when a frightened man called in to report that he and his friend, who had been driving on a county highway 4 miles west of town, had seen a 200-foot-long rocket that rose up from a field and rushed towards their position. The men were terrified of a collision and flew out of the cab, hurling themselves into the grass. As the object would pass the truck, rocking it with a blast as loud as thunder, the vehicle's engine then died and the lights went out, only to resume a few seconds later when the mysterious object had vanished. The Shag Harbour Incident. The Shag Harbour UFO incident took place on October 4th of 1967, when a large unknown object would crash into the water of Shag Harbour, a small remote fishing village in Canada. In fact, 20 fishermen and more than 40 civilians saw the large yellow light, or in some reports, lights, in the sky, and the Air Force was then alerted when it seemingly crashed into the harbor. Most of the witnesses that were there did agree that there were 4 orange lights that evening. In fact, 5 teenagers would watch the lights flash in sequence and then suddenly dive in a 45-degree angle toward the water's surface. All of the witnesses would be surprised that the lights did not dive into the water, but actually seemed to float on top, approximately a half a mile from the shore. At first, people thought that they were simply watching a tragic airplane crash, and then quickly reported it to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Coincidentally, though, the constable of the area, Ron Pound, had already witnessed the strange lights himself as he drove down Highway 3 en route to the harbor. It all may sound unbelievable, but it's also one of the most debatable UFO sightings in Canadian history. The Carson Sink UFO. The Carson Sink incident took place in July of 1952 in western Nevada. 2 U.S. Army colonels in a B-25 bomber were en route to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and while they were on their journey, saw 3 unknown aircraft. These aircraft would suddenly bank in front of them and appeared to be bright silver in color with a delta wing airfoil. However, they were also missing common items that a plane would have, like tails and a flight canopy, which every known aircraft at the time possessed. As the 2 pilots watched, the 3 unknown flying objects would make a left bank and then quickly fly to within what they estimated was 400 to 800 yards of their position. This was an uncomfortably short amount of airspace. The men could only estimate the speed of the unknown aircraft to be, at the very least, roughly 3 times what any conventional jet was known to them. After 4 seconds or so, the aircraft would then speed away out of their vision. Upon landing, they were told by air traffic control that no other aircraft had been in or around the area at the time. The Belgian Wave. The Belgian Wave is something that took place from 1989 to 1990 and is possibly the most credible UFO sighting in history. That's because over 30 different groups of witnesses have reported seeing it, and even 3 groups of police officers. There is overwhelming evidence of the reports that were seen by the citizens of Belgium, beginning with 2 guards having reported what they described as a perfectly silent large triangular object. The object was flying at a low altitude, marked with 3 bright lights at its corners, and was reported to have 30 separate groups of witnesses who saw it, with a total of 143 people in all. The peak of the activity would come 4 months later on the night of March 30th, 1990, and extended into the wee hours of March 31st, where accounts claim that a Belgian F-16 fighter plane was scrambled to intercept a number of mysterious objects in the sky. This incident would be witnessed by over 13,000 people on the ground, and this makes it quite the hard incident to deny. The Berwyn Mountain Incident. The Berwyn Mountain Incident took place in the Berwyn Mountains of Wales in 1974. That's when multiple lights and noises were observed by the residents of the Berwyn Mountains. Now, there may just be nothing more terrifying than being in a remote place and possibly under threat, especially when you believe it to be a UFO. One civilian would remark that whatever sat on the mountainside certainly wasn't the scene of an airplane crash, and that her 2 teenage daughters were beginning to become uneasy and scared. They took one last look at the scene and then turned around and went home. Nobody really knows what happened for sure in that mountain on that fateful evening. The Battle of Los Angeles. Possibly the most famous UFO incident ever is the Battle of Los Angeles. This took place in the middle of World War II when fears were at an all-time high. At the time, it was believed to be just an attack of the Japanese, but ended up being nothing. Or was it? Reports would state that a great air raid would begin at 2:25 in the morning on a clear moonlit night when the U.S. Army had announced the approach of hostile aircraft. That's when the city's air raid system would go into action, and suddenly, the night was torn up by sirens. Searchlights would begin to sweep through the sky. Gun crews at army posts along the coastline began pumping bullets into the moonlight. And tens of thousands of citizens were awoken by the screech of sirens and the popping of shells. As a result of the incident, many buildings and vehicles would be damaged, and at the end of it, 5 civilians would be dead as an indirect result of anti-aircraft fire. The blackout would finally end at 7:21 a.m. the next morning, with the government having declared that it was simply a false alarm. The James Lumley Case of 1865. We may think that UFOs didn't exist pre-Roswell, but we would be wrong. That's because there are a few thousand letters and notes circulating that describe similar cases of witnesses having seen UFOs, just as they are today, even before the invention of airplanes. Reports of UFOs were recorded in newspapers throughout the 19th century, and perhaps one of the more famous articles was written in the St. Louis Democrat, published on October 19th of 1865. This article would bring more public awareness to the concept of machines in the sky. James Lumley was an old Montana fur trapper who believed to have seen a UFO fly overhead and then crash in a nearby forest.